är jätteglad att vara här ikväll, men jag måste tala på engelska. So I excuse myself because it's been 18 months. And you'd think that after 18 months he would learn Swedish. My wife, bless her soul, is from the Netherlands, from Holland. She's very good at languages because almost every Dutch person is good at languages, as are many Swedes. And she speaks Swedish now as if she's been here for 20 years. So usually it's the older women in the församlingen will come up to me and say, but you know your wife speaks Swedish very nicely. Basically daily I get a reminder like that. So, but what can I do? I've yet to find the balance between the work itself and the study. For 2 periods I spent many, many hours up the street in Folkuniversitetet. But I mention it now because it's imperative. It's imperative for me, as the rabbi of the Jewish community of this city, to speak in Swedish. And I lay that out as the basis for what I'm about to tell you. Because it's imperative for Judaism in the 21st century to engage, to embrace, to fully interact with society around it. Now that's not something new. That's been around in many different places. And it didn't always work. But that's a little bit what I'd like to talk about. But first I want to do something rather unconventional, although with a priest as yours, who knows what's unconventional? So we begin with a nigun. A nigun is a melody without words. It's a very simple one. I'm going to sing it. I'm not going to teach it. I'm going to sing it a few times, and you'll join if you feel that you can get out of your Swedish bodies a little bit and into your souls a little bit more. We sing it and then we talk about it afterwards, okay? Something tells me that some people knew that song already. Perhaps it's just easy enough. This is a melody that was written as a lullaby. The words, I go to sleep at night and the 4 angels are around my bed, and above my bed is Shekhinah, is the Holy Presence. It was written by Rabbi Shlomo Karlebach as a lullaby. It's a very simple melody, has musical cliches taken from all sorts of Jewish music. But that tune is sung far more than a lullaby at different parts of liturgy. On the Sabbath, at a wedding, at a birth ceremony, around the table. It's a melody that has the power to go above the usual frame in which people think of religion. It transcends. And it's something that enabled us, for a few moments, I think, to have an experience, which is what I would call a spiritual experience. I chose to define spirituality this way than to start with blah, 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 blah. There's lots of words, and I have to respect philosophers, I do. But I'm not one of them. I could tell you about, maybe I could try to give a definition of what spirituality is. I've heard so many, read so many, but I would rather give examples. And my understanding of the talk this evening is, what is the challenge of Jewish spirituality in the 21st century? The first challenge is to be able to sing a song like that. People together, regardless of their background, their faith, their religion, not always the same thing, faith and religion, their heritage, to share a moment of something a little bit transcendental. It's not from the classical mystics. It's not Kabbalah. And it's not any kind of written down mysterious works from the 16th century in Sfat. It's just a very simple thing. But it wasn't always like that. So in order to talk about the future, I need to touch at least a little bit upon the past. About 2 generations before Jesus lived a man named Shimon HaTzadik. I don't think he called himself Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous. I think that's how tradition treated him. We don't know if he was called that during his time or not, his life. But Shimon HaTzadik became rather famous for one of the first paragraphs in what we call the chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first post-biblical, canonical piece of literature that we Jews have. Edited, canonized more or less at the beginning of the 3rd century. It's mostly laws about how to live life, whether it's holidays, Sabbath, blessings, liturgy, agriculture, damages. We're going to read on this Shabbat, our lectionary brings us to the part where if your ox gores somebody else's ox, and that ox dies, and you have to pay for it, all that's in the Torah. Maybe not in the parts that you read in church. It can be a little bit boring, right, to read those long lists of laws in Exodus and Leviticus. But that is the basis for Jewish law, because Jewish law encompasses every part of life, not just the synagogue itself. And so in the Mishnah, we have 99% halakha, that is Jewish law, and 1% ethical literature. Maybe it's 2%. And in this tractate called Avot, the fathers, the ancestors, Shimon HaTzadik in the 2nd or 3rd paragraph says, the world rests upon 3 things. Al shlosha dvarim, upon 3 things. Ha'olam omed, the world rests. There's 3 pillars. Al HaTorah, now I'm pronouncing it a little bit different because I'm reading it as if it's Hebrew now. At modern Hebrew, Al HaTorah, you've heard the term Torah before, Torah. Al HaTorah, and you may be thinking of the 5 books of Moses, but Torah is something far wider. It's also the 5 books of Moses. It's also the scroll which we take out in the synagogue on the Sabbath and on Mondays and Thursdays to read publicly. But the Torah is the entire body of Jewish religious literature, at least traditionally speaking. So Shimon HaTzadik says one of the pillars, one of the 3 pillars of the Torah, of the world is Torah. The next one is avodah. Now those that may know modern Hebrew, avodah in modern Hebrew is work, labor. But in ancient Hebrew, it's worship. I would say today maybe spiritual practice. We'll get back to a modern day translation. So we have Torah, we have avodah, we have the study of Jewish texts, holy texts, sacred texts. We have worship, which first meant bringing sacrifices to the temple, incense, something that everybody could do, by the way. It wasn't just the wealthy people that could afford to buy a cow or a lamb. Even the poorest of people had something to bring. It was the wood. When they excavated underneath the Temple Mount, I actually was lucky enough to have a professor, archaeologist at Hebrew University, Lee Levine, who took us underneath the Temple Mount once. And in the area which is known as the Stables of Solomon, which were never the Stables of Solomon, they're just the area when Herod built the Temple Mount, he built it upon archways. And there was these spaces they found remnants of wood, 2,000-year-old wood, which had disintegrated. Tons and tons of wood. They speculated that it must have always been filled with wood, because that was the sacrifice of the poor person. Everybody could take part somehow in what went on in the temple in Jerusalem. But then when the temple was destroyed in 70, the Common Era, the shift went from that kind of worship to prayer, to liturgy. But avodah, from a traditional point, is not just liturgy, not just prayer, not just sacrifices. It's everything that a Jew does. From putting on the tefillin, the straps, the leather boxes in the morning, and the prayer shawl with the tzitzit, with the tassels, to saying a blessing, over eating or seeing a rainbow, or feeling the earthquake, to sitting in a sukkah, a tabernacle, on the festival of booths, in the spring, to eating the matzah at the night of the Seder. All these things are part of a Jewish practice, which is a worship of sorts. So Shimon HaTzadik, he said Torah, he said avodah, and then he said gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. 3 pillars of the world. In his mind, if he was speaking today, writing one of these books about business and organizations in the world, it would be called a recipe for stability. Stability. Economic stability. Spiritual stability. All these 3 things had to be there for the world to exist. And why 3? I'm looking over here. I'm not going to take, I don't want to leave the microphone, but the camera's on a tripod, right? 3. Why 3 and not 4? Table's on 4. Have you been to Israel before? Yeah, and you've been to a coffee shop in Israel? Did you notice how your coffee always spills on the table? Always. Always. Because the table's always rocking. Why is the table rocking? Poorly made. It's not from Ikea, maybe. I don't know. It's poorly made. Because the tiles weren't laid flat in a nice way. Whatever it is, it's rocking because it has 4 legs. If a table or a chair has 4 legs, and the floor is not exactly straight, and it's not built perfectly, then the table rocks, as it does in many coffee shops, which is why your coffee spills. I know, I always get it on my shirt. But if it has 3 legs, it doesn't rock. You know that, right? It stays put. It may not be exactly level, but it stays put. And lo and behold, from an archaeological point of view, archaeologists tell us in the land of Israel, in late antiquity, tables and chairs and stools all had 3 legs and not 4 legs because floors were not straight. That wasn't something that was so much done in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, a straight floor. Maybe in the palace, in Rome, I'm sure, and other places. So it's not by chance that Shimon HaTzadik picked 3 things as opposed to 4 or 2. If it's 2, it's going to fall over. 5, it's maybe too many. 3 things. And those 3 aspects of always learning Torah, always enriching yourself as a Jew. Every week, according to tradition, you're supposed to go over the weekly portion, and we read the Torah in an annual cycle. You're supposed to go over it twice. Read it through twice with an interpretation. You on your own, not with a class, not with a rabbi, on your own. At a certain age, you're supposed to start learning Mishnah, that work that I told you, the post-biblical first writing down of the oral law. And then what comes after that is the Talmud, which was edited in the beginning of the 7th century, one in Babylonia, one in Palestine. You're supposed to learn that. As older as you get, there's more and more to learn. And when you get into the Middle Ages and you've really studied a lot and you've reached the age of 40 and you're rich in what you've studied, then you go on to study mysticism, Kabbalah. But you're always to study. Even women, I'm sorry to say even women, but in a pre-feminist society, even women were expected to read, maybe not in Hebrew, but they would read in Yiddish. Yiddish was the language that the women could read, as opposed to men could read in Hebrew if they didn't speak Hebrew. The most published book in Yiddish ever is called Sena Orena. It's a book for women to read the weekly portion. It's a kind of a rewritten Bible. It's not the exact text, it's been enriched with all sorts of extra stories. It is basic to Jewish life that you learn Torah. You're always growing in your Jewish knowledge. The second thing is, there's 3 times a day, there's prayer. That's just prayer alone. 3 times, morning, afternoon, evening. Not as many as Muslims, but more than many Christians, perhaps, other than perhaps monastics. 3 times a day, a regular Jew. I'm talking about the tradition now, not necessarily the liberal kind of Judaism that my community practices. Everything that you eat or drink, as I said, there's a blessing to say. There are 613 commandments that are listed from the Torah. Not all of them are doable because some of them have to do with sacrifices or the clothes of the high priest or punishments of death in certain situations, things that you read about in the Torah itself that we no longer do. But it starts with those 613, which are kind of slowly growing into these huge trees of things that we do. Jews do a lot of stuff. We do stuff. We think about it. I mean, every day, every minute, there's something to do. Now that is, in many ways, that's worship. We do it as an expression, or it was done. I'm going to make a change in about 15 minutes from now and kind of uproot much of this stuff, but I'm giving the background so that I can make that change. But in the past, a Jew would do these things, certainly up until the Enlightenment, for the Jews, until the beginning of the 19th century. The simple Jew, the rich Jew, the knowledgeable Jew, the not so knowledgeable Jew, would pray 3 times. A woman would go to the ritual bath once a month, waiting 7 days after the end of her period so that she'd be spiritually cleaning herself, checking herself, and then going into the bath, and then only then could she have relations with her husband. That's only 12 days. 12 days out of every month, no touching whatsoever. That's a form of worship because it's an expression of saying to God, I serve you, God. I don't serve Pharaoh. I don't serve the Caesar in Rome. I don't serve Herod, whoever. I serve you, God. And I show my serving, my worship. These are all from the same word. In Hebrew, it's all the same word, Eved. Eved Adonai, the suffering servant. Eved. The Avadim Hayinu b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Eved. Avodah is to serve. And then finally, this Gemilut Chasadim, the third pillar, is fixing the world. It's not just giving money out to the poor person opening her hand, but all sorts of ways that were devised in order to make society a better place. But when I say society, for the Jews up until the beginning of the 19th century, it meant for the Jewish society. Because let's not forget, Sweden is a bit of an optical illusion when it comes to the spectrum of history and the Jewish people. While Jews have been able to live and practice Judaism here, not in all places, but certainly in some places since the late 18th century, and have not been sent away, but most of the world is not like that. Most of the world, Jews were not welcome in any society. And even when people speak of the golden age in Spain and the wonderful things that go back and forth, historians haven't written that way for many decades already. In other words, Jews were expected to know their place, and sometimes to become Christian or become Muslims. In almost all places, persecuted at one time or another. So it's an enclosed community. So the Torah that they're going to learn, these Jews, is going to be the Torah of their own people. There's no rushing off to universities, even when universities began to exist. There's no being part of the Renaissance in that way. A little bit in Italy, but by and large, not for the Jewish people. So the Torah that they learn is Jewish Torah. The avodah that they do, the worship that they do, is Jewish worship. Nobody was going to learn yoga or meditation. There were no young Jews going yet to India, right, or to ashrams in Northern California, wherever it may be. And finally, Gemilut Chasadim, this last thing, this acts of loving kindness, extended really only to other Jews. So much so that you find sometimes in the legal literature, are you allowed to give money that's been given to charity? Are you allowed to give it to a non-Jew? It sounds rather harsh, but we have to remember where all this is coming from. Sometimes it says, yes, you have to. Why? Mishum darkei shalom, for the paths of peace, to make peace. That's the literal translation, but the real translation would be to be politically correct, so that we don't get in trouble. So nobody says, oh, they wouldn't give money to our poor people. But that was what it was to be a Jew. Now these categories, although they were said 2,100 years ago, and although they were used by Jews for 1,800 years, in a very limited way, I would say this is still the recipe for moving on in the world in the 21st century. But I want to make a change by redefining some of these things. Before I can do that, though, I have to move on to one concept which is crucial for understanding anything about the Jewish people, and that is the chosen people concept. Something that so many people have heard of and has done so much damage to our image over the centuries, because it's very easy to hate a people who think that they're special. And let's make no mistake, the Jewish people have thought, and still do in many circles, not necessarily myself, that they are extremely special. They are the chosen people. And as Christians, you know the history of Christianity as well, in which at some point Christianity said, well, they were the chosen people, but they lost their way, now we are. At least part of Christian history, the relationship between our two faiths. The Torah is written in such a way that we are the only ones that get it, as we would say in America. They just don't get it. Those other people, they don't get it. We get it. We got it. Except for when you keep reading past Deuteronomy, in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, King David, King Solomon, the Kings, books of Kings. When you get to the prophets, I'm going in order of the way our scriptures are in our Bible, a little bit different. And you get to the prophets, Isaiah, and especially Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. Apparently we didn't get it. I mean, we thought that we got it. We had it written that we got it, but somehow it got lost. We kept making mistakes. The whole lesson of the Hebrew Bible is, if I had to sum it up in one sentence or one paragraph, is that we didn't get it. We got the Torah, but we didn't get it. We were taught to be monotheists. We were taught to reject idolatry, but our hearts and our souls kept getting drawn back to that world. Now, I'm not talking about what happened historically. As a Bible major, Hebrew University, first degree, second degree, my approach is extremely critical. It's a critical methodology. It's an academic approach. I don't know what happened. I don't pretend to know what happened. The truth is, I don't really care what happened. What interests me is what's going to happen, what is happening, what's going to happen, and what I can learn from how men, not women, how men at different periods of time wrote down what they thought happened. That goes for their experience with God as well. And the reports that we get is that this idea of just worshiping one God and making a better world out of that new religion, that new ideology, that new theology, it just didn't work. It worked in certain cases, but most cases didn't. And what is the last word of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible? Basically, I'm not talking about the last word of the Book of Chronicles, but the final line, the bottom line is that one day the Messiah will come. This Messiah will be the son of the house of David, Beit David. And this Messiah will lead the armies of Israel. I'm harmonizing many versions. There's many versions of the prophets, as you probably know. But basically will lead the armies of Israel into battle against the nations. The chosen people will take their chosen place, representing God on this earth, so that in the end every human being will realize that there is only one God. And then, I hate to say it, but we rule the world. Then the Israelite nation will rule the world. That ideology was changed in a way by Christianity going a different direction, by Islam in a different direction. But that's the vision. Now, it's easy to keep saying that you're chosen and that you have the truth if you're being persecuted. Because one of the things you can say is that if we weren't chosen, why is it that nobody will accept us? Why is it that we get kicked out from place to place? If we move on, why is it that our kids are so successful at business, especially banking? If we move even further on, the same... I had a moment here where I'm thinking in Hebrew. So, Al Rosh, the same head, which is not what you say in English, but the same way of thinking leads to well, how come so many Jews are Nobel Prize winners? I'm sure you've heard that said before. Well, if not, you can hear it in the Jewish community every year. We're very proud. I forgot what the percentage is, but it's way, way, way beyond who we are in population. So it's easy when those things come up, all those signs say, well, we are a chosen people. And it's hammered into our heads as well every time we pick up the prayer book. When one is called up to read from the Torah, we honor individuals to come say the blessings over the reading from the Torah. Unlike the church where maybe many of you will come up and actually read, we have the cantor, or one of us will read because we know the traditional way of reading, unless somebody's actually studied how to do it. And so, but we still give them the honor. What's that blessing? Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. We thank God, we praise the Lord, who has chosen us from amongst all the nations. Asher bachar banu, who has chosen us, mikol ha'amim, from amongst the nations. That is what's called in Hebrew, mem ha'yitaron. That's from that elevates us. We've been elevated. We are better than they are. Now you should know, the last few decades, that liturgy has been challenged because the whole concept has been challenged. It was first seriously challenged in the 1920s in the United States by a very important thinker, Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan, who was extremely religious on a daily basis. He wasn't a Reformed Jew. He was a very pious person in his way he acted, but his mind was in another place. And he said, if Jews are going to survive in the world in the 20th century, they can no longer continue to call themselves the chosen people. Unfortunately, his ideas took many, many decades to trickle down, and even now. In my synagogue, people continue to say that particular liturgy, other than myself. Some people say, instead of Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, who has chosen us from all the people, all the nations, who has chosen us along with the rest of the nations. But I think the people that changed it that way, and one of our daughters says it that way when she's called up, I think it's because it's the same amount of beats that go to the liturgy, the rhythm. You know how that works sometimes? People don't want to change the words because they already have the melody, and maybe it's not that way in the church, but in Judaism it's very much like that. People have a melody, they know from childhood, the words are bad words, but nobody will change the words because that will mess up the melody. God forbid the melody. My idea is instead to sing the melody without the words. So people began to say, well, God chose us and the rest of the nations. But then I said, chose, so why the word chose? What did God choose us to do? On the other hand, there is an issue of choosing. My blessing is very simple. Asher bachar banu. God has chosen us. I say that, you say that. Everybody says this. Every nation on the earth must say Asher bachar banu. Because every nation and every individual has something that they were chosen to do. We as Jews have our own thing. I'll get to that in a second. You as Christians, if you're Christians, if you're Buddhists, if you're Jews, whatever, Muslims, whoever is here, you all have your own way. If you're absolute atheists, you have your own way of being chosen and bringing that chosenness to the world. And to me, that is the first thing. When looking forward in this world that we live in, and I live in a new world now, for me it's very conscious, it's very intentional because I moved to a new society. So I have a privilege that perhaps you don't have by living here, being part of something that you're kind of swept along with the flow. For me it's all new, so I'm thinking about it. When I come to Sweden and I'm as a Jew, I want to combine my Judaism with Swedish society in a way like this, and not necessarily like this as was done throughout the generations. Jews, don't get me wrong, even when they were stepped on and they were persecuted, they were still proud. Because in their liturgy, 3 times a day, and every holiday, there was this issue, you are chosen. There will be a better future for you. But it was, we are here, and they, that is the rest of the society, is over here. Things were actually going in the right direction until the 1930s. And I'm sure you've read enough about World War II, and you're not going to hear from me very much about the Shoah, about the Holocaust. Maybe I'll explain a little bit afterwards why. But that did derail this particular train. Maybe that's a bad metaphor to use here. Because the Jews of Germany thought that they were actually interacting with German society. And I don't know enough about history and German Jewish history to tell you whether what they were doing was what I'm talking about or not. I have a feeling it's not what I'm talking about. I see something far more successful in the United States and in Canada, where Jews continue to develop their faith, their thinking, their theology, as well as their practice, slowly transforming tradition, and at the same time fully interacting with American society. Here it's a little bit different. Here in this community here, because we live in the shadow of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and because Sweden in general is a rather secular society, much of the emphasis of being a Jew has gone from what you do on a daily basis to what you remember, and that is the Shoah. So this is what my suggestion is. My suggestion is to go back to those three tripod terms, to look at them a little bit differently, and to use as a basis for that re-looking at it, this idea that we're chosen for what we have to offer. Everybody else is chosen in a different way. There is a chosenness. It's just like in a family. Every child has to feel chosen by the parents. You have multiple children, you know that. We have 5 daughters. We try. Doesn't always work, but we've really tried. Everybody has to have their special time. And when 2 of them are twins, it's even more of a challenge, not to mesh it together. The same thing for people. So I'm not about to tell the nations of the world what their contribution is. But our contribution, I think, is revisiting these terms, these 3 terms, and opening it up a bit, and realizing that today we are no longer persecuted. Today, a Jew can move from any country in the world, just about any country, to any other country. Today there's a state of Israel in which if a Jew is being persecuted, that Jew can go there to live. Something not always remembered in the news here. If the state of Israel exists, there's another side of it. Now, we're not going to go into politics, I guarantee you, we're not going to talk about politics tonight. But the other side of the Palestinian Jewish-Israeli conflict is a place of refuge for Jews from around the world for the last 70 years, 60, 70 years. So what are those 3 concepts now? When we talk, I keep looking over the camera because that's the time. Torah. Today, Torah is all intellectual growth, all knowledge. And the internet, the digital age has only made this easier and inescapable. Knowledge as knowledge about the world, about people, about culture, about other religions, and surely about our own traditions. That is the new definition of Torah. An individual cannot grow, cannot be sustained, cannot sustain a lifestyle which is meaningful without intellectual growth. I'm not dogmatic about a lot of things, but I'm dogmatic about this. Everyone has to grow. Not everybody grows in the same way, at the same rate. Everybody has to grow intellectually. Worship. Instead of translating worship, I would translate today spiritual practice. Everybody needs spiritual practice. Now, if you just came in and heard that sentence, that could be misinterpreted. He's saying that everybody has to go to church, everybody has to go to synagogue, or to the ashram and to the mosque. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying as a Jew, the traditional forms of liturgy are not the only ways of spiritual practice. And they don't speak to everybody today. They speak to me. And my job as a rabbi is to widen it and translate the traditional ways of liturgy in a way that more and more people, especially younger people who are disenfranchised from it, will feel connected. But it's not the only way. Just to take the things that are right next door to us: meditation, yoga, tai chi, martial arts of different kinds, ballet, dance, we can slowly grow. There are many kinds of spiritual practice. Running. You can see I'm not one of the people that is spiritually practicing by running. But those that are running, in the snow, and they're going through your garden, and the skiing, skating, sailing, art, looking for svamp. I always like the example of looking for svamp. There's something very, very spiritual about svamp. I'm convinced. As a vegetarian, svamp has always been been a vegetarian since age 12. Mushrooms have been always the most favorite food. You come here, there's so many different kinds. And they're out there in the forest. Of course, nobody will tell you how to get there. Which only shows that it's a mystical kind of worship. Svamp. And also, what is svamp exactly? What is it? Is it a plant? It's not a plant. It's a vegetable. No, it's not. What is it? Where is it growing? There's no roots. How does it wasn't there yesterday. It's gone tomorrow. There's something very, very spiritual, very not tangible about it. But there's so many different ways. So many different ways of finding a practice in your life which is a spiritual practice. Now I could go back to the melody and say, well, what does spiritual mean? Well, it's like that melody. Whatever you were feeling inside when we were singing that song. But perhaps I could say it's something that you can't touch. It's something that brings you in contact with the other side, with the transcendental. I can't say more than that because we don't live on the other side. We yearn to touch the other side. We know intuitively there is something good there, something that will enrich our lives, something that will make us better people and allow us to make this world into a better place. All that is in that other sideness. But I can't tell you more than that because I don't know how to do it in words. I can invite you to come to the synagogue for a particular kind of a prayer, or Wednesday mornings here at a very, very early hour for a special Taizé prayer or a meditative prayer in your church. And we can feel it together perhaps for those people that connect with that. But other people will connect with it in very different ways. All of that is spiritual practice. And it's imperative that every individual, that every couple, that every family, that every community, that every city, that every nation, that civilization in general is constantly worrying about and allowing to grow, promoting spiritual practice. In the same way that every society promotes learning. Spiritual practice has not been so much, and there's all sorts of issues of religion and state. Well, let's work them out. But to ignore it, I think, is not useful. And I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think perhaps that's maybe part of our contribution as a Jewish people and as Christian folk who pray, those of you who are praying people, spiritual practice people. And then finally, fixing the world, this gimilut chasadim, this acts of loving kindness, which once upon a time was really, making sure that the beggar with his hand open, you put a coin inside. Or maybe organizing somebody to get their own job. Or creating a situation where there'd be more justice. It's interesting, by the way, the word for giving money to somebody in English, I would imagine in Swedish as well, charity, right, comes from caritas. Caritas is? Love. Acts of loving kindness. Gimilut chasadim is kind of the same thing. It's acts of loving kindness. But that's not the word in Jewish law for giving money or doing these kinds of acts. That word is a different word. It's tzedakah. Tzedakah comes from the word tzedek, correctness, righteousness, justice. Doing what we call charitable acts. In English, translated to Hebrew, tzedakah is bringing about a more socially just society. And that doesn't just apply to the Jewish community, of course. And you know what? It doesn't just apply to what we usually call social justice, like issues of homelessness, or the environment, or a fair wage, or, God forbid, rape, slavery. The things that happen in our country here and in this city here that we prefer not to listen to, but we know happens. Those are just part of it. I would say it's also people who are alone. Is somebody allowed to be alone? Are we allowed to leave somebody absolutely alone? Is it possible that somebody should die by themselves? There's a lot of questions that widen this circle more and more and more to what exactly is that third pillar. Those are the challenges for the 21st century. How do we take something as Jews that is 2,100 years old, something that was said by Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous, who's basing his wisdom on the wisdom that preceded him from the biblical books 2,000 years beforehand, until it was all collected, let's say, and edited. And how do we translate those terms today in a way that include the entire world and not just the Jewish people? And not the entire world as if we're going to teach everybody else Judaism, or at the end of days the Messiah is going to come and fix everything. But how do those things happen today? To me, that's the great challenge. And it's not easy, because there is the shadow of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, because there is still in Swedish society, I think, something that makes many Jews uncomfortable to express themselves. Not me, but then again, I'm Israeli. I lived in Israel for most of my life and grew up in Southern California and never saw anti-Semitism in my life. So you'll see me on the street just the way you're seeing me here, maybe without a tie. But I feel absolutely comfortable in my Jewish skin, but many Jews here don't. And that's something that has to be addressed. But the goal, I think, is to address it in such a way that a Jew in Sweden in the 21st century feels absolutely proud and comfortable with their Jewish skin and is ready to be part of contributing to society in a very Jewish way. So then the question is, so what is a Jewish way? Getting back to Asher Bachar Banu, the chosen, what are we chosen for? What is the Jewish way? Well, number one, we're a people that are spread all over the world. True, there's Christians and Muslims and Buddhists all over the world as well. But there's a lot in common of those people. People spread around the world who have survived for many, many years. Some say 4,000 years if you go back to Abraham. Some say 3,000 if you go back to, say, King David. Some say 2,000 if you go back to the destruction of the temple from the diaspora. But for many, many centuries. And it's not just the people who have a connection because they've been in the same genealogical line, but there's a language, Hebrew. A language that was a literary language, a spoken language, then a literary language, survived only in print or in manuscripts for hundreds of years and was reawoken and resuscitated and came to life in the 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. We're people that have a homeland. We have a place that any of us as Jews, whether born to a Jewish mother or have at least one Jewish grandparent, or have been converted to Judaism in an institutional way, have the right, the actual right to go to the state of Israel and get citizenship. That's not done here. I mean, it's almost no other country in the world that has that. You could just show up, basically show up, prove one of these things, and you can go through the process. Sometimes it's very quickly, sometimes it's days, and you could be part of that land. And not only to be in that land, especially if you're running away from a problematic situation in Iraq, in Syria, maybe in Argentina, in Russia, where Jews over the last few decades have had quite a bit of problems. Not only that side of it, but the positive side of it. The culture, the Jewish culture, the Hebrew culture, which is being built every day there. Think of it. Ad people, the people that make the advertisements for ice cream, for cars, they're writing Jewish literature. It's in Hebrew. And they're using terms that come from all sorts of aspects of Jewish tradition. It's an amazing thing. It's a connection with the past which is not really found in other cultures so much. You may in your Swedish connect yourselves back, what, a few hundred years. I'm not trying to, compete. But it's something rather unique. We can speak in a language that I can talk about a term that I've used that literally goes back thousands of years. There's a powerful connection to that. To eat matzah, unleavened bread. And I know you've got something like that up somewhere in the northern part of Sweden where they make a knäckebröd which looks just like matzah. we get it in the restaurant sometimes. It's sort of a different. But when you eat that, especially the handmade ones that I always try to get for the family, and you close your eyes and you say the words of telling the story of leaving Egypt, we've been doing this for 2,000 years. The matzah, even beforehand, we connect. A simple thing like eating, we connect in the same way that you, I know it's not all of you, but because I know there's different people, but those of you who take communion on a regular basis, you're connecting. How powerful is that? You're connecting with something very, very, and you have we just have, there's so much of that in what we do and what we say. Even the language of prayer. The language of prayer has remained Hebrew for most of us, by and large. So that's a contribution, I think. That's something that we have to bring to society, not to make us better than everybody else, but to say that here's an aspect of life that we're actually good at. Maybe this is something we'd like to share with you. Maybe it's that nigun. Whatever it may be, those are the challenges. But the assumption has to be, we are here not only to stay, but we are here to thrive, and we are here to fully embrace and interact with modern society, wherever that modern society might be. I have colleagues that would call that assimilation, and when the word assimilation in North America is used, or in the Hebrew version of assimilation used in Israel, that's considered to be negative. Here in Sweden, not so. I think it's a matter of pride for the Jewish community that Jews have been able to assimilate. But I would like to see assimilation without losing the Jewish identity. Assimilation being comfortable in one's skin and able to do this as opposed to this. And maybe just one more word to get back to our original task is given to us in this story by God. I don't know what happened, but at least what a bunch of guys 3,000 years ago thought happened and wrote down. And that is this opposition to idolatry. This pushing the issue of monotheism. And I'm not talking now about the fact that in the eyes of most Jewish thinkers, unfortunately I say, but most Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages, the Trinity was considered to be idolatrous. In other words, that proves that they don't believe in one God because they have a Father and a Son as well. The Holy Ghost, how does that work? Which one is which? Is the Father, but God is timeless, God is spaceless. But on the other hand, there were those rabbis, Meiri in the 14th century, for instance, who said, no, you guys just don't understand. That's their way of talking about the one, the same way that we have many names for our one God. But this issue of one God and not being drawn after idol worship, I think is an important message. I'm not talking now about Hinduism. I was once in an exhibit of Hindu art, and I remember seeing one of these, I don't know what they're called, but one of these statues with 17, 20 arms. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And I said to I was with a friend of mine, a good friend, a Rabbi Eli Spitz, who Ted met. And we were there at this exhibit together. It was of Tibetan, it was Tibetan art. And I said, you know what? The rabbis in the Talmud never saw an idol like that. Jeremiah never saw an idol like that. Abraham, according to the stories, that's not what he saw. He said, what are you talking about? I said, what they saw, and we know because we have archaeology in land of Israel, Palestine, they're ancient, there's what's his name? Baal. Baal, who's the god of rain, has a lightning rod as his staff. We have that. I've seen those things. Statues from 3,000 years ago. Or fertility goddesses. What's with all those statues? They're in one position. They don't move. That statue with the 17, 18 arms, you look at it, you could almost see it move. I think the whole point of having all those arms, once again, I don't know anything about this. This is my own experience. I have no idea the stories behind it. I don't even know what the name of that god or goddess is, or if it's with everything. But it's motion. It's perpetual motion. To me, that's not idolatry. Idolatry is when you think that something is static. It stays in one place. A God who doesn't live. A God who said something and that's it and it never changes. To me, that's idolatry. One of our great thinkers in the 20th century, philosopher, no longer living in the state of Israel, Shayahu Leibovich, once said that the Western Wall, you've been to the Western Wall before, you know, it's sometimes called the Wailing Wall, because Jews would go there and cry and wail, but it's the western part of the Temple Mount. Friday night there are literally thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands maybe, right? He said the Western Wall is idolatry. By the way, he was an Orthodox man, big black yarmulke on his head, and was very, very strict with laws, but he was very open in his expression. He didn't make a lot of friends by saying that. But his point was this: people are almost talking to the wall. They're putting pieces of paper in the wall. I mean, how far away is that from what Maimonides spoke about, the true goal of monotheism? Now, I understand that because many people need to have something tangible. But there is sometimes, inside of religion, even the most orthodox expression of Judaism, an idolatry. When a man, a rabbi, is made into almost a god and then dies, and I'm not talking about Christianity now, I'm talking about a very 20th century part of Judaism, the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and the Rebbe, that rabbi is thought by many of his disciples to be the Messiah, who's hovering, just waiting for us to do the right stuff, and then he's going to come. To my mind, that's idolatrous. That's missing the point. People that keep the commandments of the Torah in such a way that they constantly dishonor others and insult others, to me that's another form of idolatry. So I think that's another challenge we have as Jews to talk about. As the people that came with the idea, at least according to the books that we share together, with this idea of belief in one God, a living God, a timeless, spaceless God, something that's so much not us as people, I think those are great lessons that we might be able to share with others. So that's kind of how I see it. My role here in the Jewish community is to push the members to not be it shouldn't be sufficient for them to just go to cultural activities, to just go to the synagogue, to just support the Jewish Home for the Aged, whatever it might be. My goal is to connect the Jewish community, and therefore reflect and project that through all of society, Swedish society, to all three of these things on a daily basis. Constantly improving ourselves through study, Jewish sources of course, but everything else that will enable us to do what we need to do in life better. To continuously be thoughtful and intentional about spiritual practice, even if it's just going to a museum, but knowing that I'm going to a museum to have an experience that has nothing to do with making a living. And finally, to commit to making this world a better place. Whether you call it acts of loving kindness, fixing the world, or just making things better, all those things are the three pillars which support this world. To me, a very Jewish idea. To me, just as good in the 21st century as it was 2,100 years ago.